The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I'm glad you're with me today because I have so much stuff to discuss with you. Rand Paul, as you know, considers himself a champion of freedom and liberty. Many of his most ardent followers do as well. The First Amendment is a pretty big part of freedom in the United States, and Rand Paul has utterly embarrassed himself by saying that the First Amendment includes religion playing a role in the functioning of government. This was at a meeting of faith leaders. The Christian Broadcasting Network, which carries and certainly carries the 700 Club, Pat Robertson's show, broadcast this meeting, and Rand Paul said that the U.S. is in a moral crisis in need of a revival. And here's what he said about the connection between the First Amendment, religion, and government. Take a listen.
First Amendment says keep government out of religion, doesn't say keep religion out of government. So you do have a role and a place here. I open the Senate each Wednesday morning, and we open it every day with a prayer. So you have prayer in your government. Our religion is part of our daily life and a part of our government, always has been.
So Rand Paul says the First Amendment says keep government out of religion, not religion out of government. Actually, it does say keep religion out of government. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is the Establishment Clause. Quote, the Establishment Clause prohibits the government from making any law respecting an establishment of religion. This clause not only forbids the government from establishing an official religion, but it also prohibits government actions that unduly favor one religion over another. It also prohibits the government from unduly preferring religion over non-religion or non-religion over religion. Think about that for a second. The only way that religion could have a role in government without violating the Establishment Clause, which says you can't give preference to one religion over another, would be if every single religion influenced government equally. And as we know, that is not the case. It would be almost impossible given the number of religions. And even in the US, we have one religion of the countless hundreds, thousands, who knows how many religions there are, one religion which gets a federal holiday, and that is Christmas, and that is the Christian religion. Think about what is being said there by Rand Paul, which it's just so stunning. He supposedly is the freedom guy, and he thinks it's okay for religion to influence government. Any religious argument against gay marriage should not be considered, right? So in a debate among legislators about gay marriage, anything that brings in a religious belief relating to gay marriage should not be considered. Any religious argument against abortion or even for abortion should not be considered. It should only take into consideration secular arguments, secular data, and secular science with regard to abortion. The historical claims made by religious texts, for example, should not be part of public schooling unless they are also supported by academic historical consensus. Scientific claims, for example, about the age of the earth, they're not really scientific claims, but so-called scientific claims about the age of the earth that are based in religious text should not be a part of public schooling unless they are supported by scientific consensus. The exception, of course, is if you are teaching a class about what a particular religion believes, then you could say, this is what this religion believes about the age of the earth, for example, or about history. And of course, you are not allowed to favor non-religion over religion, and we see that. The president can be religious, senators can be religious, members of Congress. Everybody can be religious. Everybody can practice their religion. But we don't make law in this country. We don't run our government based on religion. I feel bad. I mean, Rand Paul is really embarrassing himself, and all of his freedom-loving so-called liberty advocates who are his fans should be equally embarrassed. What does gay-friendly mean when a Republican says it? I'm increasingly unsure after the latest from likely Republican presidential candidate Jeb Bush, because he's kind of considered gay-friendly. We hear about, oh, Jeb Bush is more moderate, even though He recently went pretty hard right on the issue of the minimum wage. And Jeb Bush was in Atlanta, and he actually said a bunch of stuff, actually. We have 3 data points here. He said he's supportive of businesses refusing service to gay people, of them having that right. He's supportive of individuals refusing service to gay people. He believes they should have that right. He argues that couples in long-term committed relationships deserve respect, but that others have a right to discriminate. He didn't specifically say he supports the Georgia anti-gay law that now is being discussed, but he says that absolutely businesses should be able to discriminate against people based on sexual orientation. And he also last night gave an interview to Hugh Hewitt where he praised Indiana Governor Mike Pence for signing that anti-gay bill that allows religious freedom, right? It allows the religious freedom to discriminate or refuse service to gay people. He said, quote, "I think Governor Pence has done the right thing." So Jeb Bush, supposedly gay friendly, he personally opposes the right of gay couples to marry, and he thinks that these laws that allow religious discrimination against gay people, against people based on sexual orientation or sexual or gender identity, are okay. There's so much to talk about here. First of all, what's the new definition of gay friendly? Is he gay friendly in that while he doesn't think gay people should have the same rights when it comes to marriage, and he thinks that gays should not be a protected class when it comes to business discrimination, he wouldn't advocate the killing of gays, right? Is that the bar now that we've set for being gay friendly? That's question number one. Number two, religious liberty is clearly the next front on the road to the anti-gay battle, right? Where initially the idea was, let's pass state bans on same-sex marriage. Let's prevent people from even being able to get married, blah, blah, blah. It's very clear where that's going. And I mentioned this yesterday, now that around 30 states have legalized same-sex marriage. So the next thing now is to try to preempt the marriage element by saying, hey, if your religion doesn't say good things about gay people, you can turn them away at your business. Would anyone apply this same standard of being gay friendly to other groups? If someone says, listen, I'm black friendly, I don't hate blacks, but business owners should have the right to refuse black people service if their religion says, hey, I don't like black people, would we be calling them black friendly? I really do not think so. When we talk about so-called religious freedom laws that people use to discriminate based on their self-professed, completely arbitrary, so-called, sincerely held religious beliefs, we often talk about unintended consequences, right? Religious freedom allowing discrimination against the Christians who want the law could happen. Hey, my religion says no Christians allowed. That could happen even though Christians passed that law. We talked recently about the RFRA bill that was passed in Indiana, and it may have opened the door for the First Church of Cannabis. Paperwork has been filed for the First Church of Cannabis with the Indiana Secretary of State's office. The church founder, whose name is Bill Levin, announced on his Facebook page that the church's registration was approved. And the question now is what is going to happen based on a church whose religious values involve smoking pot, even though marijuana is not legal in Indiana. Indiana attorney Abdul Hakim Shabazz was asked about this, and he says, listen, it is illegal to smoke pot in Indiana, but, quote, I would argue that under RFRA, as long as you can show that weed is part of your religious practices, you've got a pretty good shot of getting off scot-free. The RFRA, remember, spells out this test as to whether the government would unduly burden a person's faith by getting involved. And if you look at the situation around weed in a religion, religious belief says, hey, we smoke pot. And the pot smoking is less damaging than alcohol. It's less damaging than cigarettes. You could make a pretty good case that the government stepping in and preventing the free exercise of religion by banning the church from smoking pot would not be the least restrictive measure to be used here. So I think that there's a very, very good case here. And it's really funny to me how the entire religious conservative movement is sort of like the poster movement for unintended consequences. They don't want abortion, right? They try to ban abortion. But that only leads to people getting back alley abortions that are actually endangering the mother as well. They don't want abortion, but they ban reasonable same-sex education, access to contraception. What does that do? It increases the number of pregnancies, which leads to more abortion. They don't want to spend money on welfare programs, so they cut them, which has huge costs. It increases poverty, it increases crime, thus increasing the amount spent by the government and thus their tax dollars. This is the opposite movement. The religious conservative movement in the US is taking steps that ensure the opposite of what they want is actually what happens. It's amazing. It really is amazing. And I don't know if they realize it and don't care, or if they're just too ignorant to even see what they're doing. Sunday was the 2-year anniversary of the Exxon-Mobil pipeline oil spill in Mayflower, Arkansas. We covered this extensively when it happened. Thousands of barrels of crude oil spilled into the town when a pipeline burst. It forced 22 families to evacuate. A lot of those families, we have now learned, never went back to their homes. Roger Stiegel and his wife, Kathy, were on a cruise when they saw on the news that oil spilled in their hometown. They said it was sad to return home, and it was even sadder to see neighbors not come back one at a time, saying, we're just not going to come back here. This has not only ruined the reputation of the neighborhood, also property values have been significantly affected. And even after the oil itself has left, property values have not recovered. The neighborhood has not filled in terms of residents coming back in. And this is so interesting because it's this situation now, 2 years out from the spill, has so much relevance to what's going on today. First of all, corporations and compensation, right? ExxonMobil did make some payments after this spill, but they've not compensated all of those affected by the destroyed property values. They have not affected those. They have not, the city now is bringing in lesser tax revenues because of this, and ExxonMobil has not compensated the city to that extent. There's a huge social cost here that society bears. The corporation shows up, they use the local resources, they make money, and then the costs of the spills are socialized, and the corporation gets off, not scot-free, but certainly with far less financial responsibility than they should have. It brings up issues of the safety of pipelines. This is a pipeline spill, which was 2 years ago, and it is still having a significant financial impact on the town. Meanwhile, we still have many in Congress who want to further fossil fuel usage in pipelines rather than going in the direction of renewable energy. And third, broadly speaking, dependence on dirty fossil fuels. We have to get off of them, and this story really tells us a lot about that as well. So up and down, very relevant story, the Mayflower oil spill 2 years out. Tweet me about this or any of the stories we've talked about. Twitter.com/dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Huge day today for the membership program. Not only is today's new member of the day Nina Ananda, we have 4 new David Pakman Show Membership Hall of Fame members. You become inducted into the Membership Hall of Fame when you've spent 4 years as a David Pakman Show member, the duration of 1 presidential term. And today, Callie Christensen, Gary Wilson, Anthony Zayas, and Logan Coughlin, all new David Pakman Show Membership Hall of Fame inductees. Each of you gets a free David Pakman Show apparel item of your choice. Just email us, pick out your item at davidpakman.com/gear, and then get in touch with your shipping address, and we will get that out to you. davidpakman.com/membership is how you can take step 1. A journey of 4 years begins with the first day, as they say. At davidpakman.com/membership. We've been talking to you quite a bit about Turkish President Erdogan and the increasingly authoritarian extremism that has been going on at his control in that country. He has censored genitalia and the proper names of genitalia from biology textbooks, banned his military from watching shows with nudity like Game of Thrones, took issue with kissing on daytime television, rewrote history to make it more so-called patriotic, said that his religion, Islam, really positions women for motherhood and that you just can't explain that to feminists, and also blamed a mining disaster on Jews when Jews clearly had nothing to do with it. And lastly, most recently, said that he is increasingly against the internet every single day. The latest is that Turkish legislators have passed a bill giving police and government agencies even more power in clamping down on protesters, as if they needed more power. The Turkish government is now allowed to imprison demonstrators to carry Molotov cocktails. That's not really the big deal, right? There's police forces all over that can arrest you and imprison you if you're carrying around Molotov cocktails. But the law also lets police detain people for up to 48 hours without any court authorization, which empowers governors to tell police to act with no prior judicial authorization. And as far as punishment, protesters who hold insignias, signs, or put on uniforms resembling those of illegal organizations, or unfurl illegal banners, or even shouting banned slogans can get you up to 3 years in jail. The law also says anyone who hides or partially conceals their face during a protest or public assembly that turns into propaganda for a terrorist organization could be imprisoned 3 to 5 years. This is so controversial. There have been brawls in Turkish parliament over some of these provisions. So I have two feelings about this. On the one hand, the persistent move towards total authoritarianism from the Turkish President Erdogan and his henchmen is deplorable. At the same time, the fact that people, at least some people in Turkish parliament, are still willing to speak out against President Erdogan is a good thing. And the fact that there have been brawls in parliament tells us that there are two sides that are vocal about this. President Erdogan expected to sign this into law more and more like a right-wing U.S. Christian who wants to use both religion and authoritarianism to dictate what the masses should and shouldn't be allowed to do, all while stifling protest, probably publicly, though, saying that he's in favor of free speech. Although when he said he's against the internet, that kind of gave us a sign that that may not be the case. For the better part of a century in the United States, the machine that was most likely to kill an American has been the automobile. Car crashes killed over 33,000 people in 2012, which is the most recent year that we have data for, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Firearms killed just under that number, closer to 32,000 in the United States in 2011. But this year, 2015, gun deaths are expected to surpass car deaths, according to the Center for American Progress report, which cites CDC data that shows guns will kill more Americans under 25 than cars in 2015. Already, more than 25% of teenagers 15 years old and up who die of injuries in the U.S. are killed in gun-related incidents, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And a similar analysis by Bloomberg 3 years ago found shooting deaths in 2015 will probably rise to almost 33,000, and that on the other hand, auto deaths will decline to about 32,000 based on 10-year average trends. And from The Economist, certainly no liberal rag, which wrote about the projection over the weekend, it seems that the numbers are going to be this way. More gun deaths than car deaths. So the refrain from gun fetishists is, hey, cars kill more people than guns. Should we ban cars? Well, now guns are killing more people than cars. And this says a lot about the relationship of Americans both to cars and guns, right? On the one hand, we have younger people going away from car ownership, opting for ride-sharing services like Uber and what else? Zipcar, etc. And at the same time, we see the relationship that Americans have to guns increasingly disturbing. More and more Americans owning guns, with less than 5% of the world population. The U.S. is home to somewhere between 35 and 50% of the world's civilian-owned guns. 7 to 10 times overrepresentation in terms of gun ownership in the U.S., according to the Small Arms Survey. So it's not going to change the view of gun fetishists, but at least that refrain of cars kill more people than guns is no longer accurate, sadly, but it is a reality. More and more people seem to be aware that trying to film police is okay. And while police sometimes will try to get people not to film what they're doing, more and more police departments also are being trained that, hey, people are allowed to film, except in certain scenarios, right? So certain specific conditions, for example, if someone is filming police while standing somewhere that interferes with police investigation or is unsafe, in those cases, police can tell you to go away. But by and large, you are allowed to film police. And ABC 7 in Denver, Colorado is reporting that a new package of police oversight bills that was introduced in the Colorado legislature includes a measure which would fine police officers up to $15,000 if they try to stop, seize, or destroy people's cameras if they're filming, or simply stop people from filming the police. State Rep Joe Salazar said that House Bill 15-1290 has the support of both Democrats and Republicans, and that it's not intended to just penalize police. He says, quote, "It takes a very special type of person to be a police officer. We want to honor them, but at the same time, we have a few bad apples who need to be aware that their conduct now has major, major consequences." This is really a good thing. Colorado strikes again. Marijuana legalization going very well. Now we see that police need to be held accountable by society for their actions. Police bullying people, civilians, into not filming is not acceptable, and there could be a fine of up to $15,000. Now, will there be any fines of $15,000 handed out? Different question. Remains to be seen. I'm less sure, but at least getting this into the law is a very good idea. If there's something I'm missing, if there's some reason why this $15,000 fine for police who try to prevent people from legally filming their activity is a bad idea, tell me. I can't think of one. I sat around twiddling my thumbs this morning thinking of how could this be a bad thing? I couldn't come up with any reasons. If you have some, let me know. You can talk about this on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/Reddit. That's REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Johann Hari, author of the book Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. Johann, there's so much interesting stuff in here as far as addiction goes, as far as the origins of the war on drugs. The place where I want to start with you is, let's go back to the origins of the war on drugs. Many right-wingers in the U.S. that I speak to do not want to concede that there were some racially tinged elements to the beginning of the war on drugs in the United States. Let's talk about that first.
If you'd said to me when I started the journey on doing this book 4 years ago, why did the war on drugs start? I would have guessed it was for the reasons that your average person on the street would give if you stop them now. You know, you don't want kids to use drugs, you don't want people to become addicted. What was fascinating going back and looking all through the archives is there wasn't just a racially tinged element to it. The entire debate was about race. Those things that we think about barely came up. It's really shocking when you read it. I tell the story in the book. I tell this story in the book through the story of how Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, was stalked and killed by the man who launched the modern war on drugs, Harry Anslinger. And it's a really striking story, you know. She stands on stage in New York City, 1939. She sings the song Strange Fruit, a great anti-lynching song. And that night, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics order her to stop singing that song. And it's a really weird place, you think, to begin the story. You think, well, what has the Narcotics Bureau got to do with the song? It was founded the drug war was founded by this crazy racist called Harry Anslinger. Really, he's the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. And he was obsessed with Billie Holiday because she was African American, not because she was an addict. It's very revealing. At the same time, he finds out two super famous people are heroin addicts, Judy Garland and Billie Holiday. Judy Garland, he advises her to take slightly longer vacations and reassures the studio she's going to be fine. Billie Holiday, he has her destroyed. Even on her deathbed, he has her arrested. Lots of her friends thought that he effectively killed her. So it really tells you a lot about the origins of the drug war, that story.
And given the sort of dim-witted start that we got to this drug war, it shouldn't really come as much of a surprise that the results we claim to be waiting for, right, which are reductions in crime, reductions in drug usage, don't really seem to be happening as a result.
Well, it's the opposite. It, in fact, creates an enormous amount of crime. I spent a lot of time in the book with a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, called Chino Hardin, whose story I tell, an incredible person who was conceived when his mom, who was a crack addict, was raped by his dad, who was an NYPD officer. And Chino's story, I think, tells you about the dynamic that runs all over the world. When you ban drugs, they don't disappear, right? No one watching your show is so foolish they think that. What happens is they're transferred from the people who used to control them before the drug war and the people who control them in lots of countries today, doctors and pharmacists, and they're transferred into the hands of armed criminal gangs. Now, that creates a whole wave of violence that otherwise wouldn't exist. If you or me go into your local liquor store and we try to steal the beer or the vodka, they just call the cops, right? We'll be taken away. That liquor store doesn't have to be violent or intimidating. If we go up to your local weed dealer or your local coke dealer and we try to steal what they're selling, obviously they can't ring the cops. The cops would arrest them. They have to be violent and intimidating. They have to stage acts of theatrical violence that are so extreme that no one would dare to take them on. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, calculated that there are an additional 10,000 murders every year in the United States as a direct result of that dynamic. And it's not just dealers and cops who die in it. It's a lot of people who get caught in the way. Now, that's extreme enough in the United States. I went to northern Mexico. I interviewed one of the only people who's ever been at the heart of one of the deadliest Mexican drug cartels and lived to tell the story of how he butchered and beheaded over 70 people. That dynamic has destroyed Mexico. And I think a fact that every American should know, Michelle Leonhardt, the head of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, a woman whose wages you pay, was asked what she thought of the 60,000 civilian deaths in Mexico in the last 7 years. And the exact phrase she used was, "It's a sign of success in the war on drugs." That should be a national and international scandal. Americans are better than that.
And we're just starting to get some of the data now from the legalization. I don't want to call them experiments necessarily, but the initial instances of legalization here in the US, Colorado, and some data from Washington. But we can look at some other countries to look at longer term decriminalization and legalization and get a sense of what the impact could be, right?
It's really important. You're totally right. It's really important to understand there's no reason to have an abstract conversation about what ending the drug war looks like. It is being tried in practice in lots of places today. And I went to those places to see what they look like. I'll give you one example. For example, Portugal in the year 2000 had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of mind-blowing. And every year they tried the American way more and more. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people, and every year the problem got worse. In the year 2000, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and effectively said, look, we can't go on like this. Let's set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve this problem. So the panel goes away for a year and a half and it came back and it said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial thing, take all the money we used to spend on arresting and imprisoning drug addicts, i.e. making them worse, and use all that money to reconnect them with the society. And it's important to understand what that means. Partly that's things that we think of as drug treatment in Britain and America, rehab, psychological support. They have real value. But the biggest thing was something much more simple. It was about making sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. So say you used to be a mechanic. When you're ready, they'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. Really simple stuff, microloans for addicts to set up small businesses. It's been nearly 15 years since this experiment began in Portugal, the decriminalization of all drugs. And the results are in. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%, Overdose deaths are massively down. HIV transmission among adults is massively down. Street crime is significantly down. One of the ways you know it really worked is I went to interview this guy called João Figueira, who led the opposition to the decriminalization at the time. He was the top drug cop in Portugal. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug addicts prior to the decriminalization. And he hoped the whole world follows Portugal's example. Everywhere I went, but they moved beyond the drug war, and I tell these stories in the book, not only is there incredible successes, there's very few people who want to go back.
Yeah, and we recently interviewed a police officer from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition who had a very similar stories as the ones you tell. I want to get your thoughts on legalization versus decriminalization, because even amongst those in the U.S. who don't want to see all drugs be illegal, there's not necessarily consensus about legalization versus decriminalization and for which drugs. So how can we think about that?
It's worth explaining to people the difference. Decriminalization is generally used to mean where you don't punish people for using it or possessing it for their own personal use. Legalization is where you open up some route for them to legally buy it. And I think the crudest way to put it is decriminalization shuts down Orange is the New Black. Legalization shuts down Breaking Bad. So decriminalization gets rid of the problem where you're pointlessly arresting and imprisoning drug users and making their lives worse. Legalization is where you reclaim the drugs from armed criminal gangs and bankrupt those armed criminal gangs. Now, I'm in favor of both. So decriminalization is a route to legalization. I think decriminalization is a good start, but legalization is important. It's important to understand, though, what that means. Sometimes when you talk about legalizing drugs, people think, you're talking about there being a crack aisle in CVS. No one wants that. Maybe there's some crazy extreme libertarian who wants that, but virtually nobody wants that. So to understand, again, there's nothing abstract about this. Switzerland is an extremely conservative country. If it were an American state, it would be pretty much like Utah, right? I'm a Swiss citizen as well as a British citizen. And Switzerland has legalized heroin. And it's important to understand what that means. You think about how we regulate drugs already today, right? There are some drugs that you can go and just buy as an adult, like alcohol, a very powerful and toxic drug. There are other drugs you have to go to the doctor to get, right? Legalization is about expanding that kind of regulation to cover different drugs. So there's some we'll regulate like alcohol, like marijuana. In Switzerland, with heroin, they obviously haven't done that. What they've done is, if you're a heroin addict, you go to the doctor will assign you if he believes you, he'll assign you to a clinic. You can go to that clinic up to 3 times a day and you'll be given heroin and you use it there. And what's really striking is I went to this clinic in Geneva. It looks like a fancy Manhattan hairdressers. People go in the morning, they inject their heroin, and then they go off to work. Overwhelmingly, they have jobs. They get their lives back together. Do you know how many deaths from overdose there have been in that clinic since it began 20 years ago? 0. None. Not a single one. Deaths from overdose don't happen anymore in Geneva, where that clinic is. Really striking. In Vancouver, when they opened a similar project, massive fall in overdose deaths. So it's important to understand legalization is already being tried with both what we think of as soft drugs in Colorado and Washington with really great results, and with harder drugs in Switzerland. And in both places, Switzerland, as I say, a very conservative country, they have voted twice in referenda by 70% to keep heroin legal for addicts. That tells you something about how well it works, not least because there was a massive fall in crime. A burglary fell enormously. Street prostitution ended. Really striking results.
Last thing I want to talk about, Johann, in the limited time we have left, is back to this topic of addiction specifically. And you talk in your book about the studies that have been done with rats, which have really changed our understanding of what it is that makes people addicted. And it's not quite so simple as heroin makes you addicted to heroin.
Yeah, it's fascinating. A series of experiments were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your viewers can do them at home if they're feeling a little bit sadistic. You get a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and will almost always kill itself. That's where we get our theory of addiction from. That's what we think addiction is. In the 70s, a guy called Bruce Alexander comes along, a professor in Vancouver, and he said, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built Rat Park, and Rat Park is like heaven for rats. Everything a rat can want in life, it's got in Rat Park. It's got cheese and colored balls and tunnels, loads of friends. It can have loads of sex. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them ever overdose. Now, there's really important human examples of this. They're happening all around us that I can tell you about. I know we're running out of time. But what Bruce says is this shows that both the right-wing and left-wing theories of addiction are wrong. The right-wing theory is it's a moral failing, you're a hedonist. The left-wing theory is your brain gets hijacked. Bruce says it's not your brain, it's not your morality, it's your cage. Addiction is largely an adaptation to your environment. And there's really interesting human examples I can tell you about if we've got time. But that really shows the folly of the drug war approach. If what's driving addiction is disconnection and pain, the idea that we should impose more disconnection, we should in fact make it impossible for them to ever get jobs, and more pain on them, and the belief that that will make them stop is mad. I went out in Arizona, as I described in Chasing the Scream, with a group of women forced to go out on chain gangs wearing T-shirts saying, I was a drug addict and made to dig graves. Those women are never going to work again. I went to the Hole, the solitary confinement unit, where they're put, and I saw these women, these drug addicts left in this cage, and I suddenly thought, wow, this is the closest you could possibly get to actually literally recreating the cages that guarantee addiction in animals. And this is what we do to stop them being addicted. It's madness.
It's total madness, and there's obviously so much more to talk about. And what I would love to do is once we get more data, not only from Colorado, but from the other states that are decriminalizing and legalizing in the U.S., we'll have you back and we'll really dig into that data. But in the meantime, I'll remind the audience that Johann Hari's book is Chasing the Scream, the First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. Comprehensive overview of all of the elements that play into modern day war on drugs. Johann, thank you for being on.
Thanks, David. I'll just say that people can get more information at the website chasingthescream.com as well. I'm thrilled to be on your show. Thanks, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
This is pretty funny. There's an atheist named Trevor McKendrick who's making about $100,000 a year selling the so-called Word of God to Christians. He found Spanish Bible mobile phone apps that were really not that good. So he hired a Romanian programmer to improve on the apps that were already out there. He added an audio version to the app, and then that started generating $5,000 to $6,000 per month, and has grown since then. And he says it doesn't even feel like real money because the apps basically sell themselves. It's like a business on autopilot, and he doesn't really spend very much time working on it. And one of the funny things is he was actually born into a Mormon family, raised Mormon, but figured out it wasn't for him. And when he was asked about the sort of irony about the fact that he's an atheist and he's selling Bibles, he said, "We don't believe in Christianity. We don't believe in the Bible. I describe myself as an atheist," but he explained there's no moral qualms here at all. He said, what if you sold Harry Potter books or Lord of the Rings books, but you told people it was real, and you told people if they would just learn how to write spells themselves, they could heal their children, and if you sold that as a real thing, I would feel terrible about that, but that's really the situation I'm in selling the Bible. I am selling this thing I truly believe is fiction. So what do you think, right? He's a bookseller. He's selling something he knows as fiction. He's not claiming that it is the perfect and inerrant word of God. What's the big deal? Christians online are furious with him, but I don't really understand the controversy. Here's a few comments online. Yeah, it infuriates me that people can be so sick and make money off of God's word and not even believe in it. I hope Jesus saves him. Wouldn't it almost be worse if he was selling this and making money by selling God's word if he really believed it? Maybe if he really believed it, he should be thinking, I need to get this to as many people as possible without a kind of financial barrier. I don't know. Another comment online, shame, a non-believer making money off of the truth. If it's the truth and he's so involved with the Bible, don't you think that God would somehow send him a signal that this is actually the real word of God or something? I have a really hard time thinking of Trevor McKendrick as anything other than a smart business person, it's very hard for me to get mad at him. If you can explain to me, other than just I'm a Christian and that's wrong, why what he's doing is wrong or bad or unethical, let me know. He's selling something he believes to be fiction. That's it, period. The Obamacare debate has been filled with myths for years. Death panels, armed IRS agents that would arrest people who don't buy insurance, etc. And there's a new Vox poll conducted by the communications firm Perry Undum, which shows that 42% of Americans think Obamacare has cost more than expected. 5% of Americans got the right answer, which is that the Affordable Care Act has come in under budget, costing less than what was estimated. Obamacare, twice in the past year, according to the Congressional Budget Office, has been revised downward in terms of its cost. The federal government is expected to spend less on health care now than it predicted in early 2010. And those predictions don't even include any spending from Obamacare. That isn't just about Obamacare. This includes projections from Medicare, projections from Medicaid, which are the other two big federal health care programs. Those were revised down as well. But the right doesn't seem to care. And according to this poll, it doesn't seem like most Americans even have any idea. March of 2011, a year after the health care law passes, we have our first downward revision in expected costs. Again in 2013, again in 2014, and 2 times in 2015, making it 5 times that the Congressional Budget Office has cut its expectation for how much Obamacare is going to cost. Every single time, there's a very specific and sober and precise explanation. Sometimes it has to do with a downward revision in the expected cost to expand certain programs, which we saw. Sometimes it has to do with the expected cost of government subsidies, decrease there, which we saw. This is becoming like Reagan's welfare queen who never existed. It is a myth. And I still interview the Republicans who come on here and they say, oh, it's going to be more expensive. It's costing so much. And when you point out the numbers, they merely say, that's the Congressional Budget Office. It's Obama's doctoring the numbers, which of course suggests that every president has doctored these numbers, including the Republican presidents, where these same Republicans use the CBO's data to prove their points. So it's just a transparent double standard. 5 times in 5 years, the anticipated cost of the Affordable Care Act has decreased. That's it, period. 219-2-DAVID-P is our voicemail number. Call anytime. Listen to this.
Oh, hey, David Patman. This is Janelle from Buffalo, New York. I have a question. I watch all your TV shows, on YouTube. And, what I want to ask is, how come the Jews are told to never forget the Holocaust and Black Americans are told about there's no systemic and institutionalized racism? That's because I want to ask for you and Lewis, can y'all answer on that? Because that's a lot of resentment what Black Americans have towards Jews in America, which y'all are told to never forget the 6 million Jews who had died in Germany, and but Black Americans are told to get over racism, in which white Americans, they deny racism.
Okay, so listen, this is the guy who left the most vehement anti-Semitic voicemail last week. And now he's explaining why it is that Black Americans, which I presume he considers himself a member of that group, are so angry with Jews. I explained why Jews have actually worked together with African Americans for so long. So what he's saying is that on the one hand, Jews say don't forget the Holocaust, but then at the same time are saying that blacks need to just get over racism and that there's no systemic racism. I haven't heard too many Jews who say there's no systemic racism against African Americans in the United States. There's huge systemic racism in the United States against minorities. This can be seen in terms of transportation, public transit. This can be seen in terms of housing. This can be seen in terms of distribution of government benefit dollars. So I don't know which Jews you're talking about, but certainly I can speak for myself. I can speak for Lewis and just about every Jewish person I know who has expressed a view on this. I don't know any Jews who are saying hey, black people need to get over racism and there's no systemic racism in America. There absolutely is. So maybe go find the Jews that actually believe that. I certainly have not met them. On today's bonus show, we will talk about Trevor Noah being announced as the new host of The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, soon to be not with Jon Stewart. The NFL punishing a football team for pumping in fake crowd noise at a football game. We're going to talk about the Justin Bieber roast, not the conversation maybe you expect. And also, I will tell you about my recent email exchange with a right-wing radio host. Don't miss it. davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.